Obviously, the system is going toward better efficiency and less waste, but can we see that has sharing economy already put some centralized, more wasteful forms of business out of business? Is it too early to say? I was just curious, like, does it increase consumption, or is there actually proof that it's working towards better?
So the answer to that is we have almost no data. There are some small studies that look at impacts in a local area. So there are some studies of New York and San Francisco which show actually real impacts on economic activity and the ability of those kinds of entrepreneurial households or individuals to earn money. I am hoping that with the 2014 New American Dream poll, which we are doing a 10-year follow-up to our 2004, which was a 10-year follow-up to our earlier poll, we're going to have some questions that are going to give us more than what has been largely anecdotal data to this point.
We'll start over here.
I have a question that's somewhat of a follow-up. First of all, thanks so much for the presentation. It was very informative. I actually just found out about New Dream today, and I was like, I have to come to this, so it's very exciting. So as a follow-up to that question, I'm wondering if there has been any research about sharing economies and their effect on the larger economy. So, you know, the whole thing with Airbnb here in New York, there's a fear about how it will affect the hotel industry, but is there any specific evidence or research about how it's affecting the hotel industry versus New York City's economy as a whole? So that's question number one. Question number two is, both of you alluded to issues of inequality, and given the fact that, you know, the average or the median income in the United States is $30,000, and I'm looking around the room, I don't think a lot of people here fall into that category. But I don't know if this is a question for New Dream, or is it just for you two specifically, but what do you think can be done to educate and to basically market these ideas to people who fall in that $30,000 and below, because I think they have the possibility of benefiting the most from these kinds of ideas, especially given the larger, you know, things that we're talking about in the economy and the environment, et cetera, et cetera. So.
Well, to go back to that theme about you know, environmentalists not addressing some of their real problems. You know, the surveys show that about half the families in America living paycheck to paycheck, not saving, and really quite frantically strapped financially every day. And something like 40% of the families have incomes of less than twice the poverty level. So in a society where you know, there's such a vast economic insecurity, the possibility of it doesn't take, you just have to say, oh, that measure you want to see happen in the country will hurt the economy, or it will cost us jobs, or it will slow the recovery. And you hear these incantations all the time. I mean, there's just a long list of very positive things that ought to be done in our country that would you know, deal with these social and environmental issues. And almost every one of them is opposed on the ground that they would slow the economy, that they would slow growth, that they would cost us jobs. And yet, if you did those things, we know that you would improve quality of life. You would improve the living conditions of people, and that's what really matters. So what the, you know, real core of the economy is, it, you know, to keep GDP, to try to, GDP doesn't work. I mean, you know, we've had 130% increase in GDP since about 1980 in real terms, more than doubled. And during that time, you know, life satisfaction flatlined, wages flatlined, and poverty mounted to an all-time high in numbers, inequality mounted, and environment tanked, particularly on the climate issue, but on others as well. So, you know, the idea that you can, you know, solve any of these problems by just growing is clearly wrong, and it also deflects us from growing the things that really do need to grow, and you know, wages, good jobs, restoration of communities and ecology, and a lot of things we need to grow, but we're not going to have. They're not going to grow, you know, by just incanting and trying to ratchet up more GDP growth. So I think this, and in the environmental area in particular, with such a, you know, one of the constant preachments in the environmental community is to get the prices right, to internalize all those external costs that companies are imposing on the environment, and that's going to raise prices, and everybody knows that. If you put a real price on carbon, you know, it's going to make a lot of things more expensive, and you know, so the environmental community has a huge stake in dealing with the equity issues, and they are not doing that right now. So I think you're right to put it in this larger context. Your more specific question about how you might engage, you know, low-income families and people at the margin economically in these issues is something that Julie's actually written about, and those. I mean, a lot of your downshifters weren't downshifting because they were super rich, and had plenty of time and money.
So it's a great question. Actually, both your questions are really good ones. I guess I'll take the second one first, which is about the low-income communities and their participation in these kinds of things. There is interesting, you know, things move so much more quickly now in terms of an innovation in the economy moving out from where it starts. And I think in large part because of the downturn and the economic distress that so many communities are facing, you do see some of these practices being taken up in communities which, you know, it wasn't long ago that they got out of having to wear used clothing, for example, but now they're getting back to it. So working class communities which are getting very involved in clothing swaps. I had someone from Detroit who's been working with some of the most at-risk youth in Detroit, kids who have been thrown out of the high schools, and they are developing a kind of plenitude community where they're starting time banks and some also of the making skills that I didn't talk about in my presentation, but you know, I'm also studying maker movements and things, again, like Etsy, where you have a lot of makers involved. And young communities of color, this tends to be happening in urban areas where low-income communities are communities of color, particularly African Americans, and also, so the urban communities of color are picking up on a number of these kinds of things, and then also in the food space where you have other kinds of sharing going on where there's a lot of innovation. On your first question, I haven't seen studies of it, what's happening to legacy businesses or established businesses as a result of these new activities. But this is something I think we need to be really clear about, which is that if these platforms scale, as many of them are, they will hurt legacy businesses. That's, you know, if they don't, they're failing at what they're trying to do. That is the whole point, to be disruptive. So that means, I mean, that means that we have to think about what's happening to the people who are losing jobs in those businesses and so forth. So it is a painful process. It's not only a very positive thing that's happening. I think it's something that we need to go through because those, you know, a lot of those legacy businesses have failed to green themselves, have failed to become organizations where people are empowered have failed to have fair wages for their employees and so on and so forth. But I think we can't pretend that this is only a constructive thing. It also has a really important destructive dimension, and so I think what it means is we have to accept that and build in as much safeguard and protection and cushion for people in our society. That's something we've been taking away. We need to do a lot more of that.
Hi, I'm Althea. I do public policy here at Etsy, and I'm definitely a complete believer in a lot of the things that you're talking about and the benefits of the sharing economy. I know we've also been struggling with some of the downsides of the sharing economy, or at least the complexities that come with these issues, and I'd just love to hear if you have any thoughts on two that we certainly think about a lot. One being the sort of regulatory issues. So I think you see through Airbnb and others this kind of conflict that comes up when you have almost like the amateurization of things that were professional. So people running, you have a definition of hotels, and then you have people running hotels out of their homes, or you have a definition of taxis, and then you have people creating taxis out of their cars. And how do you think about those regulations were created to protect consumer safety and all of these things that I think we all agree are important? So how do you sort of redraw the lines and think about those regulations in a way that both enable this kind of great emerging micro-entrepreneurship, but also preserve and protect consumer safety and the things that government is concerned about? That's one. The other is thinking about, as we move into this world of micro-entrepreneurship, there's certainly a criticism that we're moving away from solid, safe, secure jobs, sort of what you were raising just now, towards this world where everyone is their own entrepreneur and responsible for managing their own economic security. And how do we think about building economic security for workers in a world where we're kind of going from gig to gig and cobbling together our own income? So I know those are both hard questions, but I'm curious if you've thought about either of them or if you have thoughts on them.
Okay, I'll start with the second one. I think I know more about that. I think the answer to that is, I know that term is probably, the mic go off? Yeah. That term micro-entrepreneur is probably used a lot. I think we're better off thinking about these things in more collective terms. A word that is used a lot in this world is community. I think you guys use that word a lot. And so we need to do this more in community rather than thinking about as all of us as just little firms, little individuals. I recommend to you the work of Sarah Horowitz and the Freelancers Union, which is...
She used to work there.
Okay, so they're trying to think about how to create sort of more social supports and more mutualization of these kinds of activities. And she has a post on that came out this week in, I think in Fast Company, which is really interesting on that. So we're behind in thinking about that, but I think that's a big part of the answer. I mean, something like TaskRabbit has the possibility to drive wages down to the bottom. I mean, it could create the race to the bottom. It could also, if we're able to put floors on it, and that's where we get to your first question, which is about the regulations. If we have standards and expectations and so forth built into these processes, these platforms, and these relationships, like the time bank, which is at one extreme, which is that everybody's time is valued equally in the time bank, no matter who you are. If you're a lawyer, a CEO, or a dog walker, an hour is an hour. Now that may be too far for everyone to go in this very marketized world that we live in, but maybe we need to at least take steps to in that direction. On the first one, I think that the sharing groups, they've just started the peers.org, which is a movement for sharing groups, probably another thing you're involved in. We can think about the organics and what happened with the labeling. All of the established businesses are going to do everything they can to drive this stuff out. It's important to have a movement, gain political power, and to have a real conversation. We need to be, the sharing economy needs to be regulated like any other economy. It needs to be regulated in a smart and efficient way. And this gets us back to the really important thing that Gus talked about in his 4 principles, where he talked about the idea that the people who are doing the regulating and the legislating should not be taking money from the interests that they're regulating. And that's really the problem that we have. I think if we could have a fair playing field, particularly because a lot of this is local level regulations, then I think we could come up with some good structures that really don't kill the thing, that allow it to grow, but do protect the consumer, protect the environment, et cetera.
Go over here now.
Thank you. I'm a big fan of Etsy, big fan of New American Dream. I wonder, though, I mean, certainly if a lot of makers are recycling goods and putting them out there, that's great for the economy, et cetera. But this seems like a simple question, but it keeps coming up for me. A lot of people who sell their goods on Etsy ship individual items all over the world. And I just wonder, how does that help our climate? So is that something that Etsy thinks about? And
Thanks. Yeah, actually, I'll field that one. It's something we definitely think about. We definitely see the inherent tension in what we do, and the efforts that we have to actually reduce our ecological footprint. Last year, we did a study of the domestic marketplace on Etsy, where we actually calculated the carbon footprint with the help of this man over there, JD, of every single item on Etsy. So we actually know how much something weighs, how's it going. We dug into the way that the postal service works. Nothing really goes from point A to point B. So we've got all of this data that says, okay, well, now given that information, we could filter search results by carbon footprint or whatever it may be. And these are all really interesting things that we want to do. But at the end of the day, knowing that information, we can do certain things. We know that priority mail is much worse than, say, first class. So how do we actually develop a product experience that encourages first class versus priority mail? These kinds of things. At the same time, though, I think that where we need to be heading is thinking about the business of the future that's not just dependent upon physical goods being shipped everywhere. And this is where I get really excited around both local, of course, and also new methods of production. So 3D printers, this idea of distributed manufacturing is very interesting to me. So the way I think about it is we've got a network of 1 million makers now, right? And certain arts are more replicable than others. So if, let's say I design t-shirts, and I could, design this T-shirt, screen print it over here on that screen printing press, and send it to you in France or wherever you may be. Or I could actually create a network of makers around the world and email that file directly to the maker in your neighborhood. And so this is a way that I could actually begin to connect global commerce and local commerce. And that's possible. We're not there yet. But that's how I think about this stuff. And then actually Etsy becomes more of a platform for services, for production. So it's not just physical goods being shipped around the world. Right now, that tension exists. The first step is to understand actually what that impact is, and then figure out ways that we can actually address that.
One, I think that was a really good answer, and I hadn't thought it through that way. I think if we priced energy at the real cost, it would drive things locally and solve this problem for us, and turn Etsy into a service provider, I think. But we're very far from that now.
And I agree, and I actually feel like I actually hope that's happening. And I hope that's inevitable, and what I want to do is how can I push the company to be thinking about that now, so when that does happen, we're not totally screwed. So.
Thanks. Kind of coming on the heels of that, just something that I've been thinking about a lot is that these opportunities for sharing and a different kind of production that keeps things local but really focuses on the transference of information and the transference and exchange of connection as what we're primarily trading in is very exciting, but it's also based on the internet, and it's based on technologies, and it's based on a platform that is kind of itself questionably sustainable. This may not be a question to talk about here, but it's something that I have been thinking about a lot in terms of like what kind of ideas are out there to make technology, or like like right now we have this kind of the new model in terms of computers or the platforms that we use to make these idea exchanges possible. They themselves are not sustainable, so I don't. It's just something I wanted to bring up. It's not. It might not be the question for this particular group of people.
Are you thinking primarily about the energy use and the production of computers and the use?
Yes, I'm thinking about the resources that they use to create the actual physical computer, and the fact that parts are not particularly interchangeable right now. That too.
Etsy's operational ecological footprint is almost all data center. So there's challenges there too.
We're just going to have to move toward sustainable energy, and then these things will be a lot more sustainable. I just think there's no way around that.
And I do think actually that it's the internet and technology and all of these things are going to be the thing, I believe, that can enable a kind of new economy to emerge, but they're not the new economy in and of itself. I always think about that we've got a finite amount of time to do this, so we need to move very quickly, and this will enable this. And I think something that Julie was alluding to earlier, which is really the key piece of this, is that we used to be just bound by kin, and then we were bound by city or town, and then country, and all of these things. And now we're actually, being connected globally, and it doesn't matter if you know that person or not. And that, to me, is like the key to our survival, is that you can't just build community with, your family. You need to build community with the whole world if we're going to actually address these things. And I also feel like the internet is really the foundation for, how we need to think about energy use, and can we build a smart, like Jeremy Rifkin writes a lot about in the third industrial revolution. How do you build a smart internet of energy and move that around? And I think that we can do it. We just have to decide to do it.
Hi. So we talked a lot about keeping things local. We talked about individuals participating in the sharing economy. But I wanted to get your thoughts on how this could possibly translate over to kind of this disruptive innovation for established corporations. I'm in the corporate sustainability space, and I think that there are a lot of levers in the sharing economy, especially, that could be translated over to having a pretty significant impact if you're looking at large manufacturers or people are producing large amounts of goods. Do you see ways that they're shifting their concepts of producing, manufacturing, and marketing over to shareable services, shareable goods? Things as small as Home Depot, they're starting to rent out some products rather than, promote. They're obviously still promoting buying the goods. But do you see an opportunity there, or do you see it translating back to still the individuals?
Well, I think Gus also has a point of view on this, so I'll say mine, and then he may want to answer it. I would say, for the most part, the response of the large corporations to the environmental issues that we have has been abysmal. And I mean, they have incredible resources and power. And you know, you've got the big groups, the whole groups who are trying to stop solutions on climate. And then, you know, what's really incredible to me is all these other businesses who should know better and basically are not acting. And they're not acting politically to try and make something happen. And they are doing small things, but for the most part, I would say it doesn't add up to much. But I think you do have a point of view on that.
Well, I think the question of the corporation is, and the future of the corporation is central to the whole issue of a new economy, right? And we need a pincer movement, in effect. We need to create a new type of corporation. We talked about the B Corporation, and I was glad to see your certificate. But they're you know, they're producer co-ops, they're purchaser consumer co-ops, they're worker co-ops. We need to, you know, populate the world with more and more public-private hybrids, not-for-profit, for-profit hybrids. B corporations, co-ops of all types, really a move towards the sort of democratization of wealth, if you will, and exercise a lot more public control, really democratic control over the direction of investment in society. I mean, I think that's fundamental to the whole idea of building a new economy. And it gets back to the fact that you're not going to get there unless we build a new politics, because you don't want these people in Washington making those kinds of decisions, those kinds of people making those kinds of decisions. You know, a real, but the other part of the pincer movement is that we are going to have some very innovative ways of reining in the giant corporations. I agree completely with Julie. They're not performing well at all on a host of issues. They're not even exercising the kind of you know, disinterest that corporations in the U.S. past sometimes did exercise. One longs for the days of the so-called American establishment, which would sometimes rise above the politics and call a halt to politics and get something done. But so what are some things we could do? We could be chartering corporations, the giants. You know, there's some folks that down in Virginia submitted an application to the Secretary of State to incorporate a corporation in this tobacco state that its goal was to kill something like you know, several 100,000 people a year with smoking, tobacco smoke, and it went right through. It was they got their corporate charter. It's a true story, and so there's no real screen on you know, what you can incorporate. So we ought to have real standards for who, you know, corporation. There ought to be periodic reviews. There should be a public process to see if the charter should be renewed, and you know, that's one thing. We should also have much move towards much more stakeholder involvement in the governance of the corporation. We need to, one good proposal, I think, would be to expand the concept of the Public Utilities Commission, the Public Services Board, whatever you want to call it, to a much bigger group of corporations. Right now, it's just mostly utilities, but we ought to be providing that kind of public scrutiny and public approvals. You know, the utility commissions don't just approve rates, they also approve big investment decisions that the utilities make. And we could apply this public utility model to a lot more corporations. So we have to think very creatively about the big corporation. Our friend Garl Purovitz has made an interesting proposal, which is that you know, as this boomer generation starts heading out the door with the companies that they created, it's a perfect time to think about more widespread use of the model of worker ownership. Why don't they do like so many companies have done, Gardener Supply and others that I'm aware of, and basically allow the workers to take over the company as they head out the door. There are a lot of ideas like that. I think, in the a lot of this depends on having a good government, good governance. But another good idea is for the public, not our government, but the public to take a big share in some of these giant corporations and begin to, and we had that opportunity with the automobile industry, and we gave it back to them. And at one time there was a serious discussion of what was a real public management of Citibank. Wouldn't it be great if we had state banks and we had real public democratic influence on the big banks? So we're going to have to find ways to both build up the new corporation from the ground and tighten the screws on the giant corporations from the top. And if we can't do that, we're not going to get to the new economy.
Hi, that's pretty timely. I actually work for Citibank, so it's pretty funny.
You can remember that moment when it looked like there was going to be, it was going to become kind of a public bank, a publicly owned bank, not just a stockholder-owned bank.
Yeah, I wish I was around when that happened, but unfortunately not. But my question is kind of in line with that, and talking about like B Corps and such. How important do you think the economic value of ethics is in this kind of business model, where the idea of like trusting the person that you're gonna rent your apartment to, or having that care in that this being part of the process? How critical is that to keeping this afloat as it grows?
Well, I think it seems to me that's central. I mean, there have been a lot of studies of this kind of social capital as being central to, good performance and fairness. And one of the most interesting studies was this, in the environmental area, there was always this, everybody's taught the tragedy of the commons, right? If there's a commons and it does not owned by anybody, it gets routed by so many users who have no incentive not to extract everything they can get out of it. Well, it turns out that that's probably wrong. As a historical fact, that there are just countless instances where people came together to organize to the management of the commons, and a lot of systems for doing that. And a wonderful woman, Eleanor Ostrom, got the Nobel Prize in economics for all her work in this area. But one of the findings that her group came up with was that it was absolutely essential to have a trust in the system. That these systems, didn't work unless people trusted each other. You couldn't, micromanage through regulatory processes, everything. And I think one of the big problems in the U.S. now is that, that trust has gone down, and it's everybody for himself. And if it's not outlawed, you got to do it. And sometimes even if it is outlawed, you do it. And so that's my spiel.